Before we begin, I want to tell you something important. This is a story about a man who was very, very good at lying, who spent years convincing the world he was someone he was not, who built an entire identity, multiple identities, on nothing but nerve, charm, and an extraordinary gift for making people believe whatever he needed them to believe. And the thing about a man like that, the thing you always have to keep in the back of your mind, is that the story he tells about himself might be the greatest con of all. We will get to that in time. For now, start with this. A boy in New Rochelle, New York, 1948. A Catholic family, a stationery store, a comfortable house, a father he idolized. By any reasonable measure, an ordinary beginning. What happened next was anything but. His name was Frank William Abagnale Jr., and by the time he was 21 years old, he had impersonated an airline pilot, a hospital doctor, and a licensed attorney. He had cashed fraudulent checks in 26 countries. He had outrun the FBI across 3 continents. And he had done all of it, every single piece of it, before he was old enough to legally rent a car. This is part 1 of his story, how it started, who he was before he became everyone else, and how a divorce changed everything. Frank Abagnale Sr. was the kind of father that sons write about when they are trying to explain themselves. He ran a stationery business in New York. He was charming, well-dressed, and deeply involved in local Republican politics. He was the kind of man who knew everyone in the room and made each of them feel like the most important person there. He took his son Frank everywhere: business meetings, political events, client lunches. From the time Frank Jr. was old enough to sit still in a chair, he was watching his father work a room. And he was absorbing everything. How his father shook hands, the weight of it, the timing. How he leaned in slightly when someone was speaking, making them feel heard. How he always knew the right thing to say and exactly when to say it. How people simply trusted Frank Sr. immediately, completely, without needing any particular reason to. Frank Jr. filed all of it away. He was a good student at Iona Catholic School in Westchester. Not exceptional, good. He was bright, sociable, naturally magnetic in the way that made teachers like him even when they probably should not have. He had his father's eyes. Not just the color, the quality. The way they settled on you when he was talking to you and made you feel, for that moment, like you were the only thing in the room worth looking at. He was, by most accounts, a happy kid. A normal kid. The kind of kid who grew up to be an accountant, or a salesman, or a politician. Someone who used his gifts in perfectly ordinary ways. Then, in 1962, his parents sat him down. They were separating. Frank was 12 years old. His world, which had been solid and reliable and centered on a father he worshipped, fractured quietly and completely. He was asked to choose, his mother or his father. A 12-year-old boy asked to pick a side in a war he had not started and did not understand. He could not do it. So instead, he ran. He was 16 when he left for good. Tall for his age, 6 feet, with a trace of premature gray at the temples that made him look closer to 26 than 16. He had noticed this, had begun, almost experimentally, to use it. New York in the mid-1960s was not a forgiving place to be young and broke and too proud to go home. Frank took whatever work he could find, odd jobs, deliveries, a stint as a stock boy that lasted 2 weeks before the money ran out entirely. And then he discovered checks. It started small, writing checks against a bank account that had no money in it and cashing them before anyone noticed the difference. In 1964, the banking system moved slowly. There was a gap, days, sometimes a week, between a check being deposited and the issuing bank confirming the funds existed. Frank had found the gap, and he was living in it. He was not sloppy about it. That is the thing that defined Frank Abagnale from the beginning. He was never sloppy. He studied the checks carefully, studied the routing numbers, the account formats, the way a real payroll check looked versus a personal one. He noticed that bank tellers paid very little attention to the check itself. What they paid attention to was the person holding it. A well-dressed man, confident, unhurried. That man's checks did not get questioned. A nervous boy in a wrinkled shirt. That boy got looked at twice. Frank chose to be the first kind of man. He bought clothes he could not afford with money he had not yet stolen. He walked into banks the way his father had walked into rooms, like he expected to be welcomed. And tellers welcomed him, because the most powerful tool Frank Abagnale ever possessed was not a forged document or a fake uniform. It was the absolute, unshakable confidence of a person who believed, in that moment, that he was exactly who he said he was. The check fraud kept him alive, but it was never going to be enough. The amounts were small. The risk of recognition was growing. He needed something bigger, something that would give him not just money, but cover, a reason to be anywhere, a reason to be trusted everywhere. He needed an identity. He found one in the window of a Pan Am travel agency on a Manhattan street corner on an afternoon in 1964, watching a pilot in full uniform cross the pavement toward a waiting car. The world stopped for just a moment, and Frank Abagnale had his idea. In 1964, being an airline pilot was not merely a job. It was a status, a kind of secular priesthood. Pilots were among the most respected figures in American professional life, admired for their competence, their calm, their suggestion of adventure and authority combined. They were trusted implicitly, everywhere they went, by everyone they met. And the uniform did most of the work. Frank understood this with the instinctive clarity of someone who had spent his childhood watching his father work a room. The uniform was not a disguise. It was a signal, a shortcut to trust that bypassed every question a person might otherwise ask. Nobody interrogated a pilot. Nobody looked too closely at a pilot's documents. The uniform itself was the credential. Getting it was simpler than anyone would expect. He called Pan Am's uniform supplier. He identified himself as a first officer whose uniform had been lost in transit. Could they send a replacement? They could. They did. He gave them a hotel address. He studied Pan Am extensively in the weeks that followed. Aviation magazines, manuals he found in libraries, conversations with actual pilots, whom he approached in hotel bars with the easy familiarity of a colleague, and listened to with the focused attention of a man who knew his life depended on getting the details right. He learned the language, the acronyms, the casual way pilots discussed aircraft the way other men discuss cars or sport. He learned the concept of deadheading, the practice of off-duty pilots traveling on other airlines to reach their next departure point. Deadheading pilots rode in cockpit jump seats as a professional courtesy. They showed identification. They chatted briefly with the crew. And then they sat quietly and went wherever the plane was going. Frank Abagnale, dressed in a Pan Am co-pilot's uniform, with a forged FAA license and a company ID he had constructed himself, became one of the most prolific deadheaders in American aviation history. He never flew a plane. He never touched the controls. He never needed to. He sat in jump seats and passenger seats and hotel rooms paid for by Pan Am. And he wrote bad checks in airport lounges and cashed them at bank windows where tellers looked up, saw the uniform, and smiled. The uniform was the key. He had said it himself years later, when enough time had passed that he could talk about it almost fondly. The uniform commands instant respect. And instant respect is all a con man ever really needs. He was 17 years old. He was flying across America, across Europe, across wherever the next flight was going, on an airline's dime, cashing fraudulent checks in a dozen cities. And nobody, not a single person, had any idea that the pilot in seat 2 of the jump cockpit had never sat in a flight class in his life. The check fraud was getting more sophisticated in parallel with the impersonation. Frank had identified something that banking professionals called the float. The gap between a check being presented and the moment a bank confirmed the funds behind it were real. In the mid-1960s, this gap could be several days, sometimes longer for out-of-state checks. Long enough, if you moved quickly and kept moving, to cash a check in Atlanta on a Monday and be 3 states away before anyone in Atlanta knew the account was empty. He refined the checks themselves with the same attention to detail he applied to everything else. He studied genuine payroll checks from major companies, the paperweight, the ink color, the routing number placement, the specific fonts used on official bank documents. He had grown up around a stationery business. He understood paper. He understood print. He had checks printed that were close enough to the real thing that a busy teller, glancing at them for 3 seconds while a charming pilot in a crisp white shirt made small talk, would not notice the difference. The pilot persona multiplied everything. Pilots were paid well. Pilots travelled constantly. A pilot cashing a check for several $100s at a bank nowhere near his home city was entirely unremarkable. It happened all the time. The teller would smile, stamp the check, count out the cash, and wish him a good flight. Frank would thank them warmly, fold the bills into his wallet, and walk out into the street. Over 2 years as a fake Pan Am pilot, by his own account, he cashed fraudulent checks in every state in the continental United States and across several countries in Europe. The amounts varied, $50 here, $300 there, occasionally larger when the circumstances were right. Collectively, it ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was 19 years old. He had a Pan Am employee ID he had made himself, a forged FAA license, a uniform that had been sent to him by the actual uniform supplier, a working knowledge of aviation terminology deep enough to sustain a conversation with a real pilot for an hour without raising suspicion. And he had one other thing: a growing awareness that this particular game could not last forever, that eventually someone would look too closely, ask the wrong question, run the wrong check. Frank Abagnale had always been good at knowing when to leave a room, and in 1966, he decided it was time to become someone else entirely. The transition from pilot to doctor was, in Frank's telling of it, almost accidental. He had landed in Atlanta on a deadheading flight and taken a room at a hotel near the airport. At the hotel pool, he got talking to a man who introduced himself as a doctor, a pediatrician, recently relocated to Georgia, looking for good staff at the hospital where he had just taken a position as chief of medicine. He mentioned almost in passing that the hospital was struggling to find qualified supervising residents. Frank listened to this with the focused attention he applied to every conversation that might be useful. He nodded in the right places, asked intelligent questions, and left the pool that afternoon thinking about something. He had been a pilot for 2 years. He understood by now that the uniform was the mechanism. But the uniform only worked because of what it represented: competence, authority, membership of a professional class that most people would never question because they lacked the knowledge to do so. Medicine was the same, better in some ways. A doctor's authority was even more absolute than a pilot's. Nobody questioned a doctor. Nobody asked a doctor to prove what they knew. The white coat did exactly what the pilot's uniform had done. He constructed a medical degree from Columbia University. He studied for weeks, medical textbooks from university libraries, journals, the specific terminology of pediatric medicine. He learned enough to hold a conversation, enough to ask the right questions and respond to the right answers, enough to pass in the brief professional encounters that his role would require for a man who had actually attended medical school. He applied for the resident supervisor position at a hospital in Georgia under the name Frank Williams, MD. He listed Columbia as his medical school. He was 20 years old. He told them he was 28. They hired him. For nearly a year, Frank Abagnale worked as a supervising resident at a Georgia hospital. He oversaw other residents. He reviewed cases. He signed off on paperwork. He did, with great care, exactly what a supervising resident was supposed to do, which was mostly administrative, and which mostly involved knowing when to defer to people with more direct clinical experience than himself. He had a rule that kept him safe. If he did not know the answer to a medical question, he asked the resident who had raised it what they thought. He framed it as an educational exercise, as an opportunity for them to reason through the problem themselves. The residents found him an engaged and thoughtful supervisor. He never lost a patient. He never made a decision that harmed anyone. He left after 11 months, quietly, before anyone looked too closely at the Columbia transcript that did not exist. And he drove to Louisiana. Because a man of his particular abilities, he had decided, might as well sit the bar exam. The Louisiana bar exam was, in the 1960s, one of the more demanding professional examinations in the United States. It tested legal knowledge across multiple areas of law, required passing scores in written and oral components, and was administered by the Louisiana State Bar Association with the seriousness that the legal profession applied to its own gatekeeping. Frank Abagnale sat it twice. He failed the first time, which is, if you think about it, the most remarkable part of the story. Not the failure. The fact that a man with no legal training whatsoever, operating on self-directed study and nerve, came close enough on his first attempt to justify a second one. He studied harder. Law textbooks, case studies, the specific procedural requirements of Louisiana civil and criminal practice. He sat the exam again. He passed. Frank Abagnale, who had left school without completing 10th grade, who had no undergraduate degree and certainly no law degree, who was 21 years old and currently wanted in multiple states for check fraud, passed the Louisiana bar examination on his second attempt. He applied for a position as Assistant Attorney General for the state of Louisiana under a false name with a forged Harvard Law degree. He was hired. He practiced law in Louisiana for several months, reviewed cases, appeared in court, conducted himself, by all available accounts, as a competent and professional attorney. He resigned when a colleague mentioned that he had a friend at Harvard who had graduated the same year Frank claimed to have done so. The friend had never heard of him. By the time anyone thought to look more carefully, Frank was already gone. New name, new city, new identity waiting to be assembled from the raw materials of charm and preparation and a face that people wanted to trust. 3 professions, 3 identities, 3 sets of credentials that did not exist. And not once, not one single time had he hurt anyone. Not physically, not in any way that left a visible mark. The checks bounced. The credentials were fake. But the patients were cared for. The legal work was done. The planes landed safely. Frank Abagnale was many things, but sitting in that Louisiana courtroom, in a suit that fit him perfectly, arguing a case he had prepared with genuine diligence, he was very, very good at being someone else. Before we get to where this ends up, and where it ends up is more complicated than almost anyone realizes. If Dead Air Stories is your kind of channel, hit subscribe. New parts drop every week. And drop a comment with what you think happens next. Part 2 is coming, and the story gets considerably darker before it gets anywhere near resolution. See you there. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had become aware of Frank Abagnale somewhere around 1965. The check fraud had left a trail, not a clean one, not a trail that pointed obviously in any single direction, but a pattern, a signature, the same routing exploits, the same construction of fake payroll checks, the same preference for certain bank sizes and certain times of day. An agent in the FBI's fraud division named Sean O'Reilly had begun to notice the pattern. He had assembled a file, compared the checks coming in from multiple states, noted the similarities in the paper, the printing, the handwriting on the account lines. He had a picture that was not quite a face yet, a shape, the outline of someone methodical and clever and constantly moving. For Frank, 1967 had begun to feel different. Not obviously dangerous. He was too experienced by then to mistake the first hint of exposure for immediate threat. But different in a way he had learned to respect. A slight tightening of things. Questions that lasted a beat too long. A hotel clerk who looked at his ID a second time before smiling and handing him the key. He had made one mistake. Small, easy to overlook, the kind of mistake that only matters in retrospect. He had used the same alias, Frank Williams, across too many of his identities. The pilot had been Frank Williams. The doctor in Georgia had been Frank Williams. Small variations on the paper, but the same name. The same 2 words, repeated across enough states and enough incidents that anyone looking at the pattern from above would eventually see them connect. O'Reilly saw them connect. He began making calls, cross-referencing the alias with hotel records, airline manifests, bank transaction logs, building, slowly and carefully, a picture that was starting to look like something. Frank, who had no way of knowing this specifically, but had learned to feel the temperature of a situation change before it became visible, made a decision. He was leaving America. He flew to France in late 1967 on a dead-headed flight. He had a new alias, new documentation, new story. He settled in Montpellier and attempted, for the first and only time in his adult life, to simply be himself. He took a job, a real one. He lived quietly. He did not write checks. He did not wear a uniform. He dated a woman. He had, as far as anyone could tell, stopped entirely. For 8 months, Frank Abagnale was nobody. And then, one afternoon, a flight attendant he had dated briefly the previous year recognized his face on an Interpol wanted poster in an airport. She made a phone call, and the 8 months of nobody came to a very abrupt end. Frank Abagnale was arrested in Montpellier, France in 1969. He was 21 years old. He had been a fake pilot, a fake doctor, and a fake lawyer. He had cashed fraudulent checks across 26 countries. He had outrun the FBI for the better part of 5 years across 2 continents. And he had done something that very few con men in history ever managed to do. He had gotten away with it long enough to wonder if he was ever going to be caught at all. The arrest in France was not the end, not even close. What followed over the next several years involved prison escapes, extraditions, an FBI agent who had made Frank Abagnale a personal mission, and an ending to this story that nobody, including possibly Frank himself, could have predicted. Part 2 of The Impostor drops next week. And in Part 2, the chase becomes something else entirely. Something more complicated. Something that will make you question everything you thought you understood about Frank Abagnale Jr. Subscribe to Dead Air Stories so you don't miss it. And drop a comment below. Do you think Frank Abagnale is a genius, a criminal, or something else altogether? The comments on this one are going to be worth reading. Dead Air Stories. New parts every week. Sleep well.